we're going to talk about media coverage, or specifically the challenges in securing media coverage, because it is getting harder to get coverage compared to as recent as 4 or 5 years ago. It is harder for PR agencies to get coverage for the clients, for clients themselves with their own in-house teams to get coverage. I found it quite interesting, and we were talking earlier about Joe Lycett, the comedian, hitting the headlines again this week for, again, coming out with something rather sensationalist, I guess you could say. He made up a series of stories which he then pitched to the media, and a number of them were picked up. They were published and printed in the likes of Sky News, ITV News, BBC Breakfast, The Independent, another publication that we never talk about here, the Daily Mail. One story was about a footballer who developed a bruise that looked like Prince Harry. It was completely fabricated, totally and utterly made up. And I found it really quite interesting just in terms of what it means in terms of getting media coverage. But it was interesting seeing some of the journalists coming out in defense of their colleagues who actually took these stories and thought, they look good, let's get them published, let's shove them in. And some of the comments coming back were that we need to recognise that journalists are under significant pressure to hit traffic targets, because of course the more click-throughs they get, the greater amount of advertising revenue they can then charge as a result, and also a reminder that they have a serious lack of resources in newsrooms. I get that, but there's still no excuse for publishing crap or substantiating if a story is authentic or not. But it kind of made us think, really, didn't it, about in terms of, if you are seeing stories like that, which are quite sensationalist, getting media coverage, and you're a PR agency representing a client, or your client who is responsible for doing their own media releases and trying to get stories published on behalf of themselves, and you're struggling to get any media attention at all, yet you see all this sensational stuff getting widespread attention. Does it therefore follow that we all need to start being a bit more OTT with the stories that we're putting out there in order to get the coverage that we want to get?
Yeah, I think we do to an extent. I think we need to understand that journalists are under a lot of pressure. I think there are a lot of companies fighting for the same space, and to stand out from the crowd and all of the noise, I think we need to ensure our headlines and our stories are kind of engaging, they are as interesting as possible, they are going to be the ones that people are going to click on. We need to make sure we are fitting into that news agenda, and as it increasingly becomes more difficult to kind of be featured in that space, we need to make sure our content is strong.
So you're almost kind of like bordering on writing clickbaity headlines to grab the attention.
I think so. Yeah.
Which is a skill in itself.
It is, yeah.
Trying to come up with those things that are going to resonate.
Yeah. I think it's also important to put yourself not only in the journalist's shoes but the reader's shoes as well. You know, if you're reading a story and you haven't really grasped what it's telling you in that first kind of line or even paragraph, then are they really going to continue reading? No. So it's really important to be creating content that, you know, journalists, they are confident that somebody is going to read that story and be interested by it.
So it's much like an employer when they receive a CV from a potential applicant.
Yeah.
And they are looking at it, and I think the stats show that employees would typically look at a CV for maybe 15 or 20 seconds.
Course,
and if that opening personal statement, I think they call it, if that doesn't resonate with them and give them some kind of degree of, I want to read more, this is going to add value to what I'm looking for, then they will simply just ditch it and then move on to the next press release that comes through as well.
Yeah, and it's the same with digital news as well. Everybody's looking at it on their phone. They read the headline, they're not captured by that headline, then are they really going to read it? Probably not.
So let's assume optimistically that they do read beyond the headline. I think David Ogilvy, the famous advertising mogul, for want of a better phrase, once said that people very rarely read beyond the headline. But let's assume that they do. In that opening paragraph then, what kind of information do people need to include in that? When you say you've got to get the attention, but are there specific things that need to be included in that?
Yeah, I think so. Who the company is, or who the person is, and what they are doing. What is the news? What have they launched? What have they done? Why is it interesting? And having that in that first line, you have to do that.
So it's addressing the so what, why
exactly,
does this matter? Yeah. And in terms of what actually, what is a story and what is something that's better reserved for being a blog or a good social media post? Are there certain things that really make something a newsworthy story?
Yeah, I think so. So your big kind of client wins, acquisitions, some of your senior members of the team being promoted, new hires, that kind of thing is, solid news. Anything with data or research, that's also solid news. You're offering something to the media that nobody else can give, but also, they might be interested in a company making kind of significant moves. So that is newsworthy. But if it's a smaller story and you're kind of, if you don't know it's a story and you're kind of debating whether it's a story, it's probably not a story.
Classic non-story that you see all the time is when we've had this a number of times over the last 10 years, is when you have clients who are saying, we've just hired a new salesperson.
Exactly, yeah.
Can you get this out to the media? And it's like, well, no. Because no one cares outside of your four walls, and if it's a sales organization, without sounding quite rude about it, they're probably replacing somebody who probably didn't hit their target. So it's not necessarily a representation of growth.
So CEOs and CFOs and your top of the
key industry figures who people can probably relate to and may be aware of. We said it is getting harder to get coverage for clients, and we're not exempt from that either. And I think maybe before the pandemic, dare I say, it was relatively easy, or certainly easier than what it is now. But now we're in a situation whereby a recent stat showed that there are now more PR professionals in the UK than there are journalists for the very first time. Yet the number of media outlets has increased exponentially as well. So you're in a situation whereby journalists are increasingly more reliant on PRs or marketing teams to supply them with stories. But they don't always land, and we've had instances before, and even more recently, whereby we've had what we thought was a fantastic story, but it just wasn't clicking with the journalists. It wasn't getting any kind of coverage for them. One example that we were talking about earlier was we were working with a company that provides services to the clean tech industry, which, as we know, is growing at a phenomenal pace. This company focuses primarily on talent acquisition, executive search, that side of things. We were creating some really good stories which were demonstrating, hey, look, the sector is growing significantly, and these are where the key skills are required and where the greatest demand is. But it wasn't floating. It wasn't getting any kind of traction. And I think we were all scratching our heads thinking, all right, well, what do we need to do here? How are we going to get interest here? Because these are obviously great stories. And then you've also got the pressure because you're trying to placate your client and say, look, these are really good ideas, but for some reason, they're just not grabbing them. They're not working. So we need to rethink, well, what is going to work? And then what we found actually was that there were specific skills that were being required and were in exceptionally high demand. But because it's a relatively new sector, there simply wasn't the talent available with those skills to fill those gaps, to plug that demand. And then we added a different layer to it, and it was like, well, what are the consequences of that? The consequences being is that the rapid rate of growth within the sector was at real risk of stalling if they don't have the right manpower to help it continue along the trajectory it was following. That then got the attention because suddenly it was like, oh, now we get, okay, if that isn't done, then that's the outcome. And that is going to change the outlook over the next few years or so as well. So what can companies do, other PR people do if a story just isn't getting the attention that they're looking for, because it is pretty disheartening when you craft a fantastic story and you look at it and you think, this is brilliant, says everything it needs to say, but it's falling on deaf ears. It's not getting anywhere. What process do we need to do before we can actually reissue it or do whatever we're going to do with it?
Yeah. I think sometimes you can have a brilliant story that you know is newsworthy, but the timing might not quite be right, and that might be the time you've pitched it. You know, something kind of even more newsworthy might break. There might be breaking news about the royal family, or something that is going to be prioritised over your story. So on that day, it falls to the bottom of the list, and then it isn't looked back at because it's been forgotten about. So thinking about what's on the news agenda on that day, in that week, and thinking about let's hold off. Yes, this company announcement or partnership is happening today, but let's make sure we're pitching at the right time to make sure we maximise our chances of landing this story. So I think that's really important. I think it is really important for other people to read your story. You might have read it 5 times and think, this is brilliant, but get somebody else to read it with, a different perspective, and, they might realise something that you haven't. I also think, I said the timing before, I think, you can sometimes miss a journalist on that specific day. You might be, pitching out to 5 specific people because they've been writing about that subject and they are your target. But you might miss them on that day. So, following up is never a bad idea. And sometimes they prefer a one-line follow-up to a super long pitch. So I think there's a number of things you can do. I mentioned before, putting yourself in the journalist's shoes and also the reader's shoes. So, making sure you're understanding what they want to see. And, when you're pitching, bringing that human element to it as well, I think is so important. You don't need to be robotic. You don't need to kind of just, you can bring your personality to it as well, and they might quite appreciate that. But yeah, I think there's a number of things you can do to rejig a story. There might be something in the news that you could kind of hook onto and newsjack and make it more relevant, and it might be something that a journalist goes for if they can link it to something they're working on. They're always looking for content and quality content. So if you can make their life easier, then they will appreciate you.
And I guess another thing I'd add to that as well is, if it's not necessarily a time-sensitive story, for example, this has just happened or this is about to happen, and it's tied to a particular timeline. Exercise some patience.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
we've had experience, haven't we, whereby we've had it recently. A story was put out in December and got published in March. Yeah. And you're like, gosh, and it's you can't do anything about that.
No,
but
you
like
can't.
you say, probably bigger stories dropped. I know a lot of health PR practitioners really, really struggled to get any kind of media coverage when Kate Middleton's cancer diagnosis was announced, and they were just like, just forget it. Yeah. Don't even bother trying to put a story out there, because of course there's also a risk that if you miss the big stories which are happening, and you still go ahead and put your story out there, chances are it would have been noted, but they haven't run with it because their focus is on that big story. Yeah. It makes it more difficult for you a few weeks later to pitch it again, because it's like, well, you're just regurgitating what you've already done, and we didn't run with it last time, so I'm not going to run with it now. But you just really do have to think about the timing, don't you? Absolutely. More importantly. Okay. Are there any key do's and don'ts when pitching your beautifully crafted news release, press release, however you want to term it, to the media? What things should you be doing? 1 or 2 things that you should be doing, a couple of things perhaps that you really need to avoid and steer clear of.
I think people say this a lot, but I think the headline is so important, and so is the subject line in your pitch. I would say they're the 2 kind of key things to think about, and we're always brainstorming here as a team to kind of get the best kind of short but snappy headlines so that you grab the attention of that journalist.
And ideally you want the headline to be able to fit in the viewing pane or the subject line on an email. So nothing longer than that.
And another thing I would say is knowing who you are pitching to and what they have been writing about, because there's nothing worse than sending an irrelevant pitch to somebody that doesn't write about that anymore, has moved to another news platform, or just understanding who they are and really personalizing it. I think it's so much better to select 5 people that would like to receive your story and is relevant to, rather than sending it out far and wide and hitting send on
No scattergunning.
I don't think so. No.
I heard that journalists can typically receive anything between about 30 and 40 press releases per day, and they are challenged with finding 2 or 3 of those to turn into stories on a daily basis, which, like you said earlier, it puts a lot of pressure on journalists as well. So it's really making sure that you are one of those 2 or 3 that they opt to write about.
Do everything right and make everything in the email accessible. So if you've got images, sometimes maybe it's not worth attaching them to the email because it will make the file too large, and they might not be able to receive it.
It might not get through the firewall.
Just making it as easy as possible for them to do their job. Having the press release right there so they don't have to click or open anything. Linking things that are relevant.
Now, of course, we know that rudely, not all companies use a PR agency. There we are. But we are seeing there are an increasing number of organisations who are bringing the PR function in-house. But the majority of the time, it's not necessarily internal PR people that they have. It's marketers who are giving PR responsibilities as part of their overall role. Now, it's kind of akin to asking PR people to perform a marketing function. We wouldn't do it because we don't really know what we're doing when it comes to that. We'll stick to PR, thanks very much. But similarly with marketers, we've seen it so many times. They're asked to do PR and they're not necessarily, I'm not saying they're not the right people to be doing it, but it's a very different skill set, marketing and PR, very, very different indeed. I guess that's where the advisory service that we provide really kind of like comes into play, doesn't it? Because we can act as that kind of like that guide, that support, that sense checking agency really to help clients to develop the messages that they want to communicate to their target audiences, whether it be customers, investors, or just the media in general, but also to help shape the stories around those messages and identify. I think one of the things that we've done extremely well over the years is when we start working with a new client, we'll go in and spend half a day or a day with them. We won't just speak to the head of marketing or the MD or CEO. We'll speak to pretty much everybody at various different levels of the organization to get an understanding as to why do you do what you do? Why do people do business with you? Why don't they do business with you? What are the key challenges and issues that you're facing within your sector, with your customer base? And that tends to help us identify a lot more stories that the client themselves didn't know existed and they didn't know they were there because they weren't thinking about it in those terms. And I guess it's really just trying to identify what those stories are and then shaping them in the right way, in a way that the media are going to actually want to hear about that. And for example, that could be the way you target the Daily Mail is going to be different to the way you speak to The Guardian or The Times, which is going to be different to Basket Weavers International Trade Magazine. All very different. It's the same message, it's the same story, but it's just dressed up in a very different way, specific to that target audience as well. Great. Okay, so to bring it all into a form of summary then, what 3 things would you say anyone watching this can take away that they need to think about when they're doing their own PR?
Yeah, I would say put yourself in the journalist's shoes. I would say timing is everything. And I would also say, targeting the right people at the right time is key. Yeah,
very good. I would add and say, get to the point clearly and fast. No pun intended. Or maybe there was a pun intended. So just think about those. But I think there are some really good tips that people can take away. Thank you.